Fantastic. Great stuff. So hi, everybody. Welcome to the Liberal Democrats Autumn Conference 2021 International Development Session. We've just had one great session in partnership with Bond on decolonising aid, and we're now moving on to a session looking at the Liberal Democrats' vision for aid in partnership with the Coalition for Global Prosperity. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Simon Bishop. I have the privilege of moderating today's session alongside Charlotte Baker, who is the Liberal Democrats and International Development Coordinator. My day job is CEO of the Power of Nutrition, a charity that aims to improve nutrition for the world's most vulnerable children, adolescents and women. And I'm also chair of the Coalition for Global Prosperity, so I'm somewhat double hatting today, and I hope that's all right with you. And I'm delighted to say we've got Layla Bousbar and Ryan Baldry from the Coalition for Global Prosperity team also on this call. In this event, so we're going to focus on what the Liberal Democrats' vision for aid should be, and I'm delighted to be joined by Wendy Chamberlain MP and Lord Johnny Oates. We're going to have 3-minute opening remarks from each of them, and then I'm going to ask about half a dozen questions to each of them, and then we'll open the floor to questions from the audience. Please do use the chat as much as possible, and please do amplify this on social media as much as possible. I put in the chat the main Twitter handles, so hopefully that'll help everybody. But please also drop in other useful social media handles into the chat if that helps us just get this out there. So I'm just going to introduce Wendy and Johnny. I know most of you on this call will know them very well, but just to do some short bios. So Wendy is MP for North East Fife, following her degree in English from Edinburgh University, and I think Wendy, you and I were there at the same time. Wendy joined the Lothian and Borders Police in 1999, serving for 12 years, including working for the Association of Chief Police Officers in Scotland. She's currently Chief Whip, spokesperson for Work and Pensions, and spokesperson for Scotland and Wales, and has previously been spokesperson for international development. Johnny Lord Oates is spokesperson for energy and climate change and co-chair of the all-party parliamentary group for Zimbabwe. He was a former councillor in Kingston-upon-Thames and deputy leader there, but probably best known for being Nick Clegg's chief of staff throughout the whole coalition. He's also a former director of policy and communications for the Liberal Democrats and was director of general election communications for the 2010 election campaign, and has also recently published his political memoir, I Never Promised You a Rose Garden, which I hope he will give us some anecdotes from that as part of today's session. So let's get going if that's all right. I don't know whether one of you wants to go first with your sort of opening 3-minute remarks. Any volunteers?
Well, I go first, given that you introduced me first, Simon, if that's okay. But, thank you, Johnny. You obviously weren't in the Edinburgh University footlights like me then, Simon, back in the day. But I've got to give a wee push in here for St Andrews University, my constituency, which knocked Oxbridge off the top of the Sunday Times ratings yesterday, #1 university in the UK. So that's me done that. But thank you very much for your introduction, and thank you to everybody who's here on the Fringe this afternoon. As Simon rightly pointed out, I was international development spokesperson when I was elected, so from December 2019 through to September last year. So it's a year ago since I gave up that portfolio, and obviously the merger of DFID into the Foreign and Commonwealth Office drove that. I've not got a background in international development, so the first thing I want to say is just to thank those specific Lib Dems who helped and supported me during my time in portfolio, particularly Miles Wickstead, Roseanne Palmer White, Helen Thompson and Laura Gordon. They definitely really helped keep me keep me right at the start. And I think that's testament to actually how respected Liberal Democrats are within the sector. You know, organisations were coming to us, coming to me to meet at an early stage because we have such a reputation, and that's thanks to Johnny and others for that. But as Simon, as you said, I was a police officer for 12 years, so I suppose there is that common themes aspect of wanting to help people in need. And certainly when I think back about my time in international development, one of the key challenges, other than the Conservative government in the direction of travel it has been taking, is the challenge that COVID presented from working in a cross-party perspective. I was fortunate to engage with Sarah Chamberlain at an early stage, which meant that on a number of issues, such as the Estimates Day debate, in relation to International Development Select Committee last year, which helped guarantee the retention of the committee, even with the abolishment of the department. And then also my own backbench debate last year in relation to equitable access to COVID technologies. I was the first person apparently to use vaccine nationalism as a phrase in the House of Commons. Who knew that there were websites that could tell you things like that? But I do think that actually our Liberal Democrats respect in the sector, and actually that, you know, lack of fear in owning that agenda helped us last year when I secured an urgent question in relation to the DFID merger, which took place obviously before the integrated review, which was supposedly looking at all those things, but also because Labour weren't on the front foot with this at all. And potentially that's because of the ongoing sort of narratives around Brexit and things like that. But obviously the changes last year were precursor to what we've seen in relation to the 0.7 cut and the ongoing threat, I suppose, that exists to International Development Select Committee and those degrees of oversight. But given that this Q&A is talking about, you know, the Liberal Democrat vision for aid, I think for me, when I think about vision, I think it's clear that this current government are looking at it from the completely wrong end of the telescope. I think they are looking at development spending, they are looking at aid support in terms of what it does for Britain. And actually, for me, and I'm sure for those listening, it's actually about where the need is. How can we help people in need? And also, how can we enable them? I think about, you know, the links between, you know, the narrative that has been presented around immigration and international development aid and spending. And, you know, for those refugees who are coming on migrant boats or however they're making their way to the UK, if they had the choice not to leave their homeland, would they choose to do so? No, they wouldn't. So how can we best support so that people don't have to make those kind of journeys? Thank you.
Thanks very much, and it's great to follow Wendy. I'm always reassured that we have a former member of the police service as our chief whip in the Commons, so I'm sure she knows how to deal with any disorder. First of all, I fully endorse Wendy's thanks to Miles and to all the team at LDID. I think they do an amazing job in ensuring that our reputation as a party is very high in this regard, so they deserve all our thanks. Just a couple of comments from me to start off with. This year has been really quite depressing for many reasons. I mean, COVID, obviously, but personally, for me, politically, the ending of the 0.7% commitment by the government was particularly devastating. It's something that got me involved in politics in the beginning. And to see what the Conservatives have done at this particular moment is terrible. And what makes it worse is that it wasn't a surprise. In fact, to me, it was entirely predictable from the first meeting on the legislative programme during the general election, during the coalition in 2010, when, if you'll remember, both Conservatives and Liberal Democrats had 0.7% in our manifestos. But only the Conservative Party had a commitment to legislate in the first session of Parliament to make that law. And in that first meeting about the legislative programme, George Osborne and Cameron made it clear they didn't want this in law. They said because the programme was too busy, and we kind of bought it the first time. But as years went on, it became absolutely obvious that they didn't want it. And of course, it only became law because of Mike Moore and Jeremy Purvis, who was in the last session, who brought that as a private member's bill, and it passed into law. So really sad to see that, and particularly because in this time of pandemic crisis, we have imposed a treble whammy on the most vulnerable economies and people in the world. So first of all, we've cut the aid budget. I mean, it would have fallen anyway, very significantly because of the fall in our own GDP, but we slashed it even further. Secondly, we cornered the market in vaccines, which meant that their economies already hard hit, find it much harder to recover. And the figures for the percentage of vaccines that have got to the developing world are absolutely shockingly low. So that's had a real social but also economic impact. And then the third element of that treble whammy was that we've imposed these highly restrictive travel restrictions, which are hugely damaging to economies, particularly in the part of the world I know, in Africa, where a lot of economies rely very significantly on tourism. And the decision yesterday, I welcome very much that Kenya has been let off the red list, but the decision to keep South Africa on it, we should be in no doubt about it, that is going to have a massive impact on their economy, and that means on people's jobs and on their livelihoods. And I have sought answers from the government repeatedly as to why they are not taking a sensible approach on this, but they have not come forward with any of them. Final thing I just wanted to say is, I think in terms of aid, we'll have lots of time to discuss it. It is incredibly important. Equally important is the economic development of those countries through their own private sectors. And we've got to support that, because aid can only ever be a small part of this. What we want is for these economies to be self-sufficient and to be able to provide the public goods to their own citizens without need from us. So those are just my initial thoughts, Simon, but thank you very much for inviting me to take part.
Thank you very much, Johnny and Wendy, for those opening remarks. And we want to spend most of today looking at the vision, the way forward. But I did want to sort of start with a couple looking back, and particularly you, Johnny, given your sort of long passion for international development, and Wendy, I know you said you were sort of new to it when you took on the brief a couple of years ago. But Johnny, just and I was sort of thinking about today's session. It's partly a formal session. We're halfway towards a fireside chat time of the day. So just to make it a little bit more informal. So just, Johnny, can you sort of say when you first became passionate about international development and why?
Yes, I mean, it was a very specific moment sitting in my parents' sitting room in 1984, I think it was October, when what became a world famous broadcast by Michael Burke from Tigray province in Ethiopia led the 6 o'clock news. And I watched in kind of horror and I suppose anger as well, this footage from that place. At the time, it was a time of grain mountains and butter mountains and wine lakes in EU for people who can remember back. So there was huge amounts of sort of wasted food going on, and yet people were starving on the plains of northern Ethiopia. And I just thought, this is absolutely wrong, and it's absolutely wicked. And I mean, I was not alone in thinking that, and luckily I was 14 at the time. Luckily there were some people with a little more influence than me, most notably Bob Geldof, who started Band Aid, and that became Live Aid, and really started raising the profile of something that the Liberal Party had been fighting for since 1973, I think, which was that we should meet UN targets. And that's really what inspired me to go into politics. And one of the reasons I joined the Liberal Party was because although the Labour Party had some commitments in this regard, the Liberal Party and subsequently the Lib Dems was the only party that really seemed to talk about them, want to talk about them and fight for them. And so it's an absolute key part of what got me involved, and so I was so delighted during the coalition that we got to that 0.7%, and hence why I'm feeling so devastated at the moment. But that's how I got involved in the beginning.
And when you look back at the coalition years, when it comes to international development, presumably your proudest achievement is the 0.7. But are there other international development sort of things that we achieve that you think, that you're particularly proud about?
Well, one of the things I'd actually say, and this sort of takes looking forward as well, I think that it wasn't just that we delivered 0.7%, which was fantastic, but actually that DFID became, this is an overused phrase by this government, but it became a world-beating organisation, respected around the world, listened to around the world. We had disproportionate influence. And this is the depressing thing, that we've torn up those actually world-beating things in order, it seems, to go after things that aren't world-beating at all. But the one thing looking forward is, I think we need to think about how aid is used much more strategically. And I don't mean that in terms of how the government thinks of it. Wendy referred to this for, how does it strategically help Britain? But how does it actually strategically deliver for the people in the countries and regions where we are supporting development? And I think we've got to give much more thought to that going forward.
Fantastic, thank you. Maybe we can come on to that more in a minute. So Wendy, for you, in terms of the very depressing year we just had that Johnny's outlined, and particularly losing the 0.7 and losing DFID, where does that leave UK aid, and where does it leave a Liberal Democrat vision for aid in the years ahead?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I had thought about when I first became interested in international development, and it's probably, I'm a wee bit younger than Johnny, but I've got a very vivid memory of being at primary school and buying UNICEF stickers, like to put on things. That's certainly sort of that first making that connection as a child to sort of other children globally, and them wanting and needing the same things is certainly something that stayed with me. And obviously I've got remembering Live Aid and things as well. So I think I always remember making that connection, that to other children being just like me. And obviously I've come to the Liberal Democrats a lot later. I joined in 2015, as I always say, crying at Nick Clegg on the telly. But there's always that bit where, certainly that internationalist outlook is something that always aligned me to the party and had meant that they had always had my vote. And I also remember as a child sort of David Livingstone, Mary Slessor, and obviously we can talk about the connotations empire-wise and things as well, but certainly that Scots going out into the world and, well, in that the way at that time helping those in need. But there's no doubt that the 0.7 is hugely devastating, and I suppose the only crumb of comfort I can take from it is the fact that clearly it's caused some dissatisfaction and discomfort within the Conservative ranks, and we clearly saw that. And in fact, somebody just tweeted me to say that if we had PR, because that's the Fringe that I've just been on, the vote wouldn't have failed. But I think one thing that I've tried to sort of demonstrate and talk about in relation to the 0.7 again is the impact that it actually has here in the UK as well. I mentioned the University of St Andrews there at the outset. The ODA cuts have come in now, and there have been cuts to university grants, research grants here in the UK. So again, for me, it's cutting your nose off to spite your face. I think the other thing is that Johnny talked about how world beating DFID is seen globally, and UK is seen as a global leader. And going back to that sort of empire colonialism, your last topic, I think it's really important actually that the UK does, because we've been responsible for a lot of the difficulties some of these countries have found themselves in historically. But I think one of the issues is that there was definitely this sort of narrative of sort of wastefulness around aid spending. And the reality is that never came from DFID, that was within the other government departments. And the loss of DFID actually makes that spending less transparent. And one of the things I did with the support of Sarah Champion and other members of the International Development Select Committee was table a presentation bill for an ODA Select Committee to actually have that oversight of all of that spending across all the government departments. And it was part of that narrative to help retain the Select Committee. So just kind of looking forward, you know, I think we are in a position where we are at risk of becoming a follower, and if that means other countries step up to the plate, I obviously welcome that. But you know, it seems to me a very depressing a vision of a global Britain, which we're seeing across a number of fronts. And in a week where we saw the Prime Minister come and make his, is it AUKUS, whatever the acronym statement is in relation to our new sort of workings with Australia and the US, the reality is that is obviously about creating a presence in the Indo-Pacific and potentially looking to China. But by stepping back on the ODA spending front, we've actually given and we've opened a door to China to go into places such as Johnny referred to in Africa, etc., to provide the funding to those governments that potentially where the UK would have been in the past. So for me, I think it's not just depressing, but it's overall strategically incoherent. So I would absolutely agree with Johnny that that strategic direction is something that's very much lacking.
Johnny, do you want to come in on that, or shall I move on to another question?
No, happy for you to move on.
So we know civil servants at the moment are writing the new international development strategy. So we had the integrated review that, you know, massively downplayed the importance of development and Britain's world leading reputation in development, which was extremely disappointing. But what would each of you say would be the key planks that you would want to see in that new international development strategy? And presumably, Johnny, one of them, and it would be good if maybe you could talk to this one, would be around, given your brief, around you know, climate change and helping the world's most vulnerable people, basically limit the impact that climate change is likely to have on them. But yeah, what will be some of the sort of key planks that you'd like to see in that international development strategy?
Thanks, Simon. I think you put your finger on it. The absolute priority has to be climate change, because unless that is addressed, all the other focuses that we might have on aid and development will come to naught, because, you know, we are talking about some of the countries and peoples which are most vulnerable to climate change. So that's got to be upfront dealt with. The second thing I'd say is I think that I'm getting a bit of feedback, but I hope you can hear me. But the second thing I'd say is I think we ought to look very carefully about how we can most effectively support governance, rule of law, democracy issues, because they are really critical to the sustainability of development. And I mean, Ethiopia, which is the country where through the Michael Burke news bulletin first inspired me, but I ended up actually at age 15 running away to Ethiopia, thinking I could help kind of change the world, and finding I couldn't. But the one thing that really troubled that country, on top of the difficulties of famine and drought, was the appalling governance it had under then Marxist military dictatorship, and the violence and war, civil war that was going on. It had a period after that regime was overthrown of some stability, but that stability was at the cost of suppressing dissent, and of course we've seen what happened as soon as some of the lid was lifted off that, it exploded, and tragically Ethiopia is in a very perilous situation today. So I think, you know, it's very important one thinks about that. And then the third element I'd just say is that we need to employ strategies regionally. I think Southern Africa is the part of the world that I know most. As you mentioned, I'm chair of the APPG on the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Zimbabwe, but also I spent a couple of years living in South Africa and working with rural communities there and in the parliament there. And it seems to me one of the tragedies of that region is that at the time that South Africa was emerging from the apartheid regime and embracing democracy, Zimbabwe, which was potentially the other driver of the regional economy, was descending into economic chaos. And that was, again, because of bad governance. Now, all these things seem to be dealt with separately, but I think we need to think much more in terms of the carrots that regionally can be offered that can provide kind of incentives for peer pressure. I want to see us, for example, we've had a peaceful handover of power in Zambia recently after an election. You know, we really need to show the people of Zambia that where there is good governance, there is support that follows that. So I think some of the sort of principles about the Marshall Plan in the post-war period for Europe should be applied, which is that they do relate to democracy and governance as well. And they do try and reinforce regional blocks. I think that's really critical.
Thanks, Wendy.
Yeah, I back up a lot of what Johnny said there, and actually I've picked up the comment from Sally in the chat as well. You know, I think it is about being more strategic, and I think it is about being integrated. The other thing that's quite interesting for me is I've got a constituent locally who had worked in the sector, and you know, had a couple of conversations with him, and he always said to me, don't refer to it as aid. So to talk about development spending, because I think there is still absolutely that narrative around helping, and therefore they're not people, developing countries are not able to help themselves. But you know, you would expect me, I suppose, Johnny commented on me as chief whip as a former police officer, but there's no doubt that rule of law, you know, the comments here are talking about corruption in various countries. We're certainly talking about that now in relation to Afghanistan and the situation there, and in the aftermath of the Taliban retake over, that there's absolutely no doubt that unless you have functioning democracies that development spending can support, in many ways you're potentially throwing good money after bad. So you know, I think Johnny's spot on there.
You've both already made it clear that you think we should be helping the world's poorest out of a sort of moral imperative. And I'm always, you know, I've got my Lib Dem membership card here, and it, you know, the words in it, we exist because no one shall be enslaved by poverty, obviously goes to the right of the heart of what the party stands for. Is there any place, so if you've got the poverty first approach, is there any place for national interest in our aid spend? Can you do both, a poverty first moral approach and deliver national interest? And if there is a place for both, should we be trying to do both? Johnny, for you first.
Well, I think the economic development of those less developed countries is absolutely in our national interest. Again, I mean, I refer most to Africa because that's part of the world I know best, although very imperfectly. But some people may have read the article that William Hague wrote in the Times, I think it was, or perhaps it was the Telegraph, a few weeks ago, where he really highlighted the crucial role that Africa is going to play in world affairs over this century, and particularly for Europe. So I don't think development, and by the way, Wendy, I think you're absolutely right. That is the terminology we should be using rather than aid. But I don't think we should think about our development spending in terms of what is our national interest in X country, because I actually think that's the way to drive really perverse outcomes. And very often, you know, you find that government who you think is in your national interest might not be there, or else they might decide they prefer the Chinese or somebody else who are a bit easier on them on certain issues. So I don't think that's the way we should regard it. What we need to think about is that raising the prosperity and the well-being of people across the world and across the poorest countries in the world is critical to our national interest and to the global interest as well.
Yeah, as well as previously being a police officer, I also worked in HR, and one of the terminologies we talked about latterly was around, VUCA environments, volatile, uncertain, ambiguity. Those are the things that we're dealing with. So I would come back to what I said about integrated. There is just no way that you can have, strategic decision making without it being integrated in some degree, and the risk is that you end up working in silos. So for me, I think poverty first approach is the way, and actually if you're making the right decisions from a poverty first approach, the other things will follow. Doing the right thing from a poverty perspective actually means that you're more likely to make better decisions that will benefit the UK from a defence perspective, from an economic perspective, because actually you're taking the right and moral approach first.
Just one final question from me, if that's all right, and then I can see questions in the chat, and I'd urge people to please write more questions, and we'll try and pick a few out. And Charlotte, maybe I'll turn to you in a minute to help me do that. But from a political perspective, aid has arguably, or if you don't want to call it aid development, but this issue has been quite non-political, right, for much of the last decade, with most of the parties supporting 0.7, supporting an independent DFID, supporting us sticking to the global aid rules, promoting the global goals, supporting or being opposed to tied aid. There's not been a lot of clear water between the different parties. It feels now like there is substantive clear water between us and certainly the Conservatives on 0.7, on having a separate international development department. You rarely hear the current government talking about the global goals and thinking about framing our approach to the world through the lens of the global goals. We'll see whether or not the government sticks to the current DAC aid rules. Is this, from a political perspective, obviously it's not what we wanted, any of this, but from a political perspective, is it sort of a side effect sort of helpful in that it is a way in which the Liberal Democrats as a party can clearly define itself differently to certainly the Conservative Party? Last question to you, Johnny. Do you want to go first, and then finish with you, Wendy?
I don't see any benefit at all. I think it was very important that we had a political consensus, just as it is important on climate, that we maintain as much as we can a political consensus. Of course, we have to stand up and say what we believe and we should do. But I don't see it being politically advantageous because of the impact on the people around the world, which is massive. But of course, we must be clear and continue to stand up for those people. But I think it's an absolute tragedy. And when I look down at the list of some of the Conservative MPs who voted for that, who know it's wrong, some of whom actually campaigned against it, before they were MPs, I am shocked by the lack of integrity and really disappointed because some of them were friends of mine.
Wendy? Yeah, I think the reality is that the Conservatives have stepped back. We haven't moved. And I suppose, yeah, it seems quite base to talk about it from a political advantage level, but I thought it was very telling that in the debate on the development spending cuts, that Andrew Mitchell talked about the fact that that Chesham and Amersham had the highest number of Christian Aid members in the UK. So in some respects, that sort of maybe highlighted that not only have the Conservatives step back from the political consensus that Johnny described, but as well as that, they have stepped away from people who have supported them in the past. I hate to think, well, it's distasteful, I suppose, to think about that from a political advantage perspective, but I suppose what it does do is feed into a wider narrative that certainly Chesham and Amersham, brought into very sharp relief, that there are people who would call themselves Conservative with a small c, who are global and internationalist in their outlook, morally want to do the right thing to alleviate global poverty, and they're discovering that the party that they've traditionally supported is no longer with them. I think that's a reality that we can't totally escape from, and actually how what we do is we continue to do what we've always done, which is to stand up for those in need, to stand for our internationalist values, and hope that others feel uncomfortable and disappointed and disgusted about the position that the government has put us, the public, NGOs, people working in the sector, and finally, most importantly, the world's poorest in.
Thank you both. There's a question from, and apologies if I don't pronounce your name properly, but from Indijana Harper in the chat. I very much agree with Lord Oates on the importance of supporting the private business building in aid recipient countries, but how do we ensure that our ethical approach is preserved? I observed in Bosnia how aid directed to private sector fueled corruption on the ground, even where there had been scant evidence of it before.
Well, what I'd say is I'm not speaking specifically about channeling aid to the private sector. That's not what I'm about. I think it's about understanding that ultimately the prosperity of any of these countries we're talking about cannot be delivered or sustained by development assistance on its own. And that what we should be doing is working with governments and the private sector in the countries in which we are engaged to ensure that the framework exists for the private sector to operate effectively. So, for example, in Zimbabwe, they once had an absolutely thriving private sector. The problem is it's now mainly in the hands of the military or people who are connected to the military or ZANU-PF, which is just about the same sort of thing these days. And that not only is deeply damaging to the economy because there's no longer the kind of innovation and entrepreneurialism that there once was, but it's damaging also, it's a sort of vicious circle in terms of democracy and governance, because the independent media and political parties, which actually thrive despite the huge pressure of the ZANU-PF government, a lot of that was sustained because there was a strong private sector, a strong civil society, both of which have been massively damaged. So I don't think it's about us handing out aid to private businesses, but I do think it's about us working in those countries to ensure that the framework exists in which they can thrive, and understanding that ultimately that economic development will be driven by the private sector at the end of the day.
Yeah, I'm absolutely aligned with Johnny there in terms of, the role for me of development spending goes back to those governance, rule of law, creating the frameworks on which economic growth can be delivered. And I think one of the things for me is actually reflecting on how fragile democracy is, that we take a lot of these things for granted. I certainly remember as when my children were small, the Red Cross advert of the child in Syria, and in the space of 2 birthdays, how her world had changed, absolutely been turned upside down in a way that, as her parents could never have imagined or anticipated. I think we've certainly seen that in some countries, the ongoing situation in South Africa, that, it doesn't feel like South Africa is well. in any way, shape or form, and we're seeing it in other parts of the world as well. So it is about how can we best support the frameworks, the democratic frameworks that allow the private sector to thrive, rather than funding those directly.
Thank you both. Tavia Chalmers has written, I'm concerned that the aid that went to LGBT groups has been cut back. The situation in Uganda led recently to a cross-party letter to FCDO. I'd welcome a discussion on this area.
Yeah, I'll come in on that, David. Happy to discuss and pick up. But I think that, again, for me, is another example of, some of those norms that I think we've taken for granted in this country in the last decade being utilised, weaponised by this government in relation to its approach. It's not just, the situation for LGBT minorities in many parts of the world is hugely concerning, but I think there's been an overall step back by this government across the board. But David, obviously, I think we're connected on Facebook anyway, but happy to pick up with you and see how we can potentially work from a parliamentary perspective.
Just to add briefly, I mean, I think that the situation in Uganda is deeply worrying and has been over a number of years. And the one thing, I mean, I would really pay tribute to some of the incredibly brave people in Uganda, people like Frank Mugisha and many others who have really put themselves on the line. It is hard to overstate the courage of those people, and we should be behind them. I think we also need to understand that some of this anti-LGBT kind of rhetoric is being driven not just internally by those who wish to disparage people from those communities, but also from outside, and particularly from the US evangelical churches. I think we really need to do more to expose this, because you see lots of fronts. We've seen this in Kenya with attacks on women's right to contraception and other things, where fronts which are really financed and driven from the West are set up and cast as a kind of anti-colonial thing, but in fact are very much the imposition of a different Western morality. So we should be very cognizant about that in our approach.
Thank you both. Charlotte, do we have the technical ability to get people to actually ask questions directly rather than me just reading them off the chat? Or do we want to urge people to continue to drop questions into the chat?
Yeah, I would suggest getting people to continue to drop questions in the chat. There's a couple more points that have been made, which I would flag, like Brian's point about kind of how would we conceptualize a reborn DFID? How would we build back better, and what would that look like once we've managed to restore it as a separate DFID? I thought that's an interesting question.
Do you want to both respond to that one?
Will I come in, Johnny? I mean, we obviously were fundamentally opposed to the abolition of DFID, and looking forward, I can't see how we wouldn't, as a party, be looking to re-establish that. And I suppose, going back to Johnny's comments in terms of world beating, would I be looking to reinvent the wheel in that regard? Because a lot of what was there is very good. The expertise is very good. In fact, the staff are very good. Obviously, a lot of what was DFID remains in East Kilbride, and in fact, from what I hear anecdotally, that there continues to be issues around the merger. It's not gone well as anticipated. It won't have gone as well as expected, and actually a lot of the silos and work will still exist in many regards. I think the challenge is how long does that take? The longer FCDO exists as an entity, then there's more clearly there to unpick. And that obviously is the challenge. But I think it is about looking at it in the round that DFID is again, it's the structure, it's the engine that drives the work that NGOs, other agencies and in government supports do. And actually, I would like to think that a lot of that expertise will still exist. I suppose the other concern is obviously that alignment from foreign offices overseas. And again, that comes back to that longer term. If the strategic direction is what's in it for the UK, then it becomes very challenging, doesn't it?
I would just before you come in, Johnny, on this one, I was actually at an event earlier this week with Miles Wickstead, who I think is, who we have to now call Sir Miles, of course, who I think is, which is fantastic, somewhere. I think he's on the chat and hopefully still here, but at an event earlier on this week with him, with a wonderful speaker going through the sort of history of the last 50 years of Britain's international development work or approach. And what is great is, there's been whenever the pendulum has swung towards not having an independent department or nesting it inside the Foreign Office, the pendulum has swung back the other way a few years later. It is fair to say that this merger is of a different order to those earlier ones. So the earlier ones, you'd still have, like, for example, the Overseas Development Agency. It was still, whilst it was underneath FCO, it was a separate building, a separate agency, and had quite a lot of autonomy. So I think we need to recognise this one is of a different order. And then there was a worrying article the other day from in DevEx, the International Development Trade press, saying that more than 200 DFID staff have already left. So obviously over time there is the risk of a brain drain. But nevertheless, I'm sure if we could get the pendulum to swing back again and have an independent department, we would attract back some of that amazing expertise that we've got. And let's hope that a lot of it is retained in the new department and does stick around for the future as well.
Absolutely, Simon. And I suppose you would expect me to say, as a Scottish MP here, this is more risks to the SNP bill in relation to the breakup of the UK, given that DFID really was one of the standout departments based in Scotland. And I've got Miles's book here, first thing he gave me at our first meeting, it really kind of got me up and running.
Excellent. Yeah, it was a must read. And yeah, I've spent time up in East Kilbride, and it's full of extraordinary, passionate, just the best you can get of civil servants. So let's hope. I'm not up to speed on how that's being impacted by the merger, but let's hope as little as possible. Johnny, do you want to come in on that?
Just very briefly, I agree absolutely with what both of you said. The only thing I would add is, I think it's absolutely essential that the foreign policy of the UK also is integrated in terms of our aid policy. Now, that's not, the government's argument is you do that by the FCO being one department with the development organisation. I don't actually think that's right, but what I do think is right is that for a long time, we've put very significant amounts of development assistance into Africa, for example, and yet the interest in the British government towards Africa has been practically zero at a senior political level. And if I give you the example of Zimbabwe, where we tragically now continue to supply, although I suspect it's been slashed massively, but certainly before the pandemic, we were supplying emergency food assistance to Zimbabwe, which is crazy, absolutely crazy. It shouldn't be necessary, but unfortunately it was. But we had no sustainable, thoughtful foreign policy in that region. Foreign secretaries didn't understand it. They didn't visit the region. They didn't spend time in South Africa. We didn't give any of the sort of commitment that other countries do. And as a result, we've had a crazy policy that swung between being almost the representatives of the NDC, which we should never have done, despite the fact that, I wish they'd won elections, but we should never have allowed ourselves to the next moment saying, oh no, Edson Mnangagwa was the guy who was going to be all fine and this was going to be great, which anybody who had the slightest knowledge of Zimbabwe could have told you was absolute nonsense. But we've got to actually think strategically. Foreign policy, aid, we've got to put these things together. But above all, we've got to show that as a country, we actually care about these regions. Because right now, if you talk to people who would normally be sympathetic to us in Zimbabwe, The people they're getting their vaccines from is China and Russia. It's Sputnik and it's Sinovac. And frankly, they'd probably much prefer AstraZeneca or Pfizer, but they aren't getting it.
Yeah, there is definitely, going back to that vaccine nationalism point, there is a spiky position for the Lib Dems to take in relation to booster jags, 12 to 15-year-olds, etc., that actually the priority when the greatest risk is from the mutation of another variant coming from another part of the world, that should be our focus. Potentially not the most popular, but I think there is a strong argument that absolutely can be made for that. And I think we've got to be very conscious that we've been very fortunate that the Delta variant has not has been the most significant variant we've seen in the last few months, but that more is likely to come. The other bit, again, I agree with Johnny, in terms of that strategic incoherence. I had a Westminster Hall debate last week in relation to the British Council cuts. Again, that just seems to be cutting to the bare bone and not thinking about potentially where the British Council can economically generate or income generate in the future. And if you align that to things like the Turing scheme, etc., it's just completely incoherent. I'm gonna have to go for 2 seconds to let a teenager into the flat. I'll be back.
Okay, thank you. Well, maybe John, I can ask you one final question. Catherine Sturgis put in the chat, and I think we partly started to answer this in the comments that you and Wendy just made. But still, how do we show to the voters and argue in Parliament that development spending is as important as demonstrations of hard power like AUKUS or AUKUS? I don't know how you pronounce it.
Well, I think we've got to make the moral argument. I mean, Wendy. Spiky policy that she has just mentioned, I, by the way, would wholly support, partly because I think it is absolutely morally unjustifiable what we're proposing to do when people far more vulnerable are not getting the vaccine. But secondly, just from a point of view of self-interest, if we want to defeat this pandemic, we've got to defeat it around the world. We can't just defeat it in the UK. So I think that sort of spiky policy is morally right. I think Wendy's absolutely right. In some ways, in some quarters, it wouldn't be popular, but it would get cut through, and we could absolutely stand by it because it's the logical thing. So I think the way we get cut through is by making the moral argument, talking about these issues not in terms of statistics, but in terms of real lives, because we know. All across the regions that we care about, we know the people who are suffering, the people who are dying actually because they haven't got access to these kind of health facilities, because they haven't got access to the vaccines, because of the aid cuts, which means that tens of thousands of girls won't go to school. All these things which have real life effects on people forever. We need to make the argument in those terms.
Yeah, absolutely. And then you think about the cuts to the WASH scheme, etc. as well. This isn't just about vaccines, it's about that access to clean water, actually preventing the hygiene methods that are required to help this global pandemic abate. It's scandalous in some regards.
Thank you both so much for a wonderful discussion. Hugely appreciate it. I hope all of you in the audience enjoyed it as much as I have. I don't know whether either of you want to make any just final closing remarks before we finish, or if you're done. Up to you. But do you want to just a final couple of remarks each?
I just say finally, I am immensely proud to be a member of a party that cares about this issue so much, that has set out its stall and has campaigned relentlessly over decades. And many people wonder, what is the point of the Liberal Democrats? The point is that we were voicing these issues back in the early 1970s at the time of the Pearson report, when nobody was talking about that. And we kept banging on about it, and we were joined by people, thankfully, of all parties and of none, by faith groups who had also been campaigning over those years. But we really did make a difference. And one of the reasons that the Conservative Party put in their 2010 manifesto that commitment, which they subsequently reneged on, was because they were scared we were eating into their votes. So don't let anyone tell you that it doesn't have an impact electorally. That's not the reason we're doing it, and it's not the reason we should do it. But we should take the argument to the Conservative Party, and we should ensure that those good Conservatives of a liberal mind who care about the international order know our position and understand it, so that they can come, hopefully, and support us in trying to ensure that the poorest people in the world get a far better deal.
I seriously can't top that.
I was going to say, it's pretty good. Fantastic. Yeah, that was very sensible, I think, Wendy, because that was wonderful. Great way to finish off, Johnny. Thank you very much. Although we've just lost you off camera, but you've gone, you've left us in a in a fantastic way. Thank you so much, both of you. Just wonderful, and thank you very much to all of our audience too. And a big thank you on my behalf from me to Charlotte, my other moderator, who has been making all of this work behind the scenes as well. So thank you very much, everybody. There's Charlotte, actually sitting in New York as well, believe it or not, doing an internship at the UN as we speak. So yeah, thank you so much, Charlotte, and thank you to everyone for joining the session. And I hope you have a brilliant rest of the Lib Dem conference. Enjoy the rest of it. And Wendy, good luck with your birthday parties tomorrow. I hope you fit those in too.
Lovely.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you all very much for joining. Bye-bye.